The judge laughed at the humble man, but when he said he had saved his life in the past, Walter James Thompson felt his heart race as he listened to the laughter echoing through the room. His hands trembled, bound by handcuffs that seemed to grow tighter by the minute. At 72 years old, he never imagined he would be there, wearing that orange jumpsuit, being treated like a common criminal. "So you expect this court to believe that story?" The judge's voice cut through the air with mockery. "A man your age with your appearance trying to deceive the justice system with fake documents?" The words fell upon Walter like stones. He tried to respond, but his voice came out weak, almost a whisper. The guards beside him remained motionless, their faces serious beneath their beige uniform caps. One of them, younger, looked away as if witnessing this humiliation was too uncomfortable. "Speak up," ordered the magistrate, banging his gavel on the table. "Or are you not just a forger but deaf as well?" New laughter emerged. Not much, but enough to make Walter feel shame burning his face. He cleared his throat, gathering strength. "Your Honor, I didn't forge anything. These documents are mine. I was only trying to—" "Trying what? Cheat the system? Get benefits that don't belong to you?" The judge leaned forward, his narrowed eyes full of disdain. "Look at you. Old clothes, calloused hands. I bet you never worked properly a single day in your life, always looking for shortcuts, isn't that right?" Something broke inside Walter. It wasn't anger. It was a deep pain coming from a very old place. His calloused hands, as the judge had said with such contempt, were marks of 50 years of honest work. 50 years of carrying loads, cleaning, fixing, helping. And now he was there, being accused of dishonesty by a man who looked at him as if he were trash. "I worked my entire life, Your Honor," Walter managed to say, his voice still quiet but firm. "I was a janitor for 43 years in the same building. I've been waking up at 5 in the morning for decades. I never stole anything from anyone." The judge laughed. It wasn't a restrained laugh, it was loud, exaggerated, meant to humiliate. "A janitor!" he exclaimed, looking around as if seeking complicity. "And I'm supposed to believe the word of a janitor about the authenticity of documents. How many degrees do you have? How many courses in paper forgery did you take?" Walter lowered his head, not out of shame for who he was, but because the cruelty of those words hurt more than any imprisonment. He thought about giving up, about simply accepting whatever came next. What difference did it make? No one there cared about the truth. No one wanted to hear his story. But then something inside him ignited. A memory. A recollection he had kept for so long that he had almost forgotten its importance. He slowly raised his eyes, fixing them on the judge's face. Really fixing them, for the first time since he had entered the room. And that's when he saw it. Beneath the weight of the years, beneath the black robe and the arrogant posture, there was something familiar. The eyes, the shape of the face, a nearly imperceptible scar near the left temple. Walter felt the air leave his lungs. It couldn't be, but it was. "Your Honor," Walter began, his voice now different, carrying a weight that made the judge stop mid-sarcastic comment. "I know you." The silence that followed was absolute. The judge blinked, confused. "What? Don't be ridiculous. I've never seen you in my life." "No, you have seen me. A long time ago." Walter took a step forward, ignoring the tightness of the handcuffs. "You had darker hair back then. You were thinner. And you were crying under a bridge." The judge's face lost all color. His fingers, which seconds before had been confidently drumming on the table, froze. The eyes, which had earlier dripped with disdain, now showed something close to panic. I don't know what you're talking about," the magistrate stammered, but his voice trembled. "Mercy Bridge in Pittsburgh," Walter continued, each word coming out with more certainty. "It was March. It was raining heavily. 3 in the morning. You were there, alone, looking at the water below." The defense attorney, a young man who until then seemed to just be following protocol, raised his head, suddenly attentive. Murmurs began to spread through the room. The judge banged his gavel, but the sound came out weak, without authority. This is a pathetic attempt at manipulation," he tried to regain his composure. "Officer, remove this man from my courtroom." You had a blue notebook, Walter said before the guards could move. Hard cover, with the edges already a bit worn. You were clutching it as if it were the only thing left in the world. And maybe it was. The judge stood up abruptly, knocking papers off his desk. Enough, I won't allow— You had failed for the third time. Walter's voice was calm now, almost gentle, as if telling a story to a frightened child. On the exam, you were giving up on everything, said it wasn't worth it, that you'd never amount to anything. Tears began to stream down Walter's wrinkled face, but he didn't wipe them away. And I told you that everyone stumbles, that falling isn't shameful, that shame is not getting up when you still have strength in your legs. The room was in complete silence. Even the guards seemed to have forgotten their duties, watching the scene in astonishment. The judge had both hands on the desk, as if he needed it to keep from falling. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. I offered coffee. Walter smiled through the tears. You said you didn't drink coffee, but you drank 3 cups that night, and ate the bread I had brought for my work breakfast. Stop, the judge's voice came out as a hoarse whisper. Please, stop. I won't stop, Your Honor. Walter shook his head. Because you need to hear this. You need to remember. For 3 months I let you study in the tool room of the building where I worked. Every night. I brought coffee, sometimes a snack. I stayed there, keeping you company, just so you wouldn't feel alone. The judge fell back into his chair, his face hidden in his hands. His shoulders shook. And when you passed the exam, Walter continued, his voice choked but firm, we took a picture, just the 2 of us. You were so happy. Said I was the only family you had, that you'd never forget what I did. A sob escaped from behind the magistrate's hands. The prosecutor, who until then had been watching with growing discomfort, stood up. Your Honor, perhaps a recess would be best. And you forgot, Walter finished, his voice now just a thread. Forgot everything. About me, about who you were, about where you came from. The judge uncovered his face. His eyes were red, his face wet. All the arrogance had disappeared, leaving only a middle-aged man who seemed much older at that moment. He looked at Walter as if seeing him for the first time, truly seeing him. Mr. Walter, the voice was broken, disbelieving. Mr. Walter Thompson? Walter nodded, a sad smile on his lips. The recognition hurt more than the denial. Richard, he said simply, you've grown, boy. The impact of those words was like a lightning strike. The judge, Richard Anderson Parker, as the nameplate on his desk indicated, seemed to have been physically struck. He stood up again, staggered, had to lean on the desk. I didn't— He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. How— I request an immediate recess, the prosecutor practically shouted, realizing the situation had spiraled completely out of control. This hearing cannot continue under these conditions. But no one moved. Everyone present was hypnotized by the scene unfolding before them. An elegant middle-aged woman in the front row had her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide. She looked from the elderly man in the orange uniform to the judge and back again, trying to process what she had just witnessed. Richard, she stood up, her voice trembling. Richard, what's happening? The judge didn't even look at her. His eyes were fixed on Walter, and in them swirled a whirlwind of emotions. Shock, shame, pain, and something that looked very much like terror. Elizabeth, he began, but couldn't continue. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out now continuing. Elizabeth, the woman in the front row, had been Richard's wife for 28 years. She knew him better than anyone, or at least thought she did. But the man she saw now, shattered and exposed before everyone, was a stranger. She slowly sat down, unable to look away from the scene. I need to think, Richard murmured, running his hands over his face. You need to recuse yourself from this case immediately, the prosecutor interjected, his voice now firm and professional. There's a clear conflict of interest. This hearing is adjourned. The guards finally reacted, moving to escort Walter out, but the elderly man gently resisted, his eyes still on the judge. Richard, he called, and there was so much sadness in that single word. I never wanted anything from you. I never expected gratitude. But I also never expected to be treated like garbage by the boy I helped get back on his feet. Those words fell like a final hammer blow. Richard doubled over as if he'd been punched in the stomach. When he finally managed to look at Walter again, tears were streaming freely down his face. "Mr. Walter, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." But Walter was already being led out, the guards doing their duty despite their obvious discomfort with the situation. The room erupted into conversation as soon as the door closed behind him. Journalists who had been present to cover other cases were already on the phone. Lawyers exchanged shocked looks. Elizabeth remained seated, pale as paper. Richard collapsed in his chair, his head in his hands. Everything around him seemed to be crumbling. The room, the court, his career, his entire life. Everything built on a lie he had told himself for so long that he had begun to believe it. The lie that he had gotten there alone, on his own merit, without anyone's help. In truth, Richard Anderson Parker hadn't gotten there alone. And now in front of everyone, that truth was exposed like an open wound. In the days that followed, the case became the talk of the entire courthouse in Pittsburgh. Whispers followed Richard through the halls. Colleagues who had once greeted him effusively now looked away, some out of contempt, others out of pure compassion, but both hurt equally. Elizabeth barely spoke to him at home. She slept in the guest room, and her responses were monosyllabic when he tried to explain. How could he explain? How could he tell the woman he had shared nearly 3 decades with that he had deliberately erased the memory of the man who had saved him from total ruin? "You always said you made it on your own," she finally confronted him on the 3rd night, her voice cold as ice. "How many times have I heard that story? How many times did you tell it to Catherine, to our friends?" Catherine, their 25-year-old daughter, studying psychology in Ann Arbor. Richard had hoped the news wouldn't reach her, but in an age of cell phones and social media, that was impossible. She called on the 4th day. "Dad, is it true?" Her voice was hard to interpret. Not angry, but not understanding either. "What they're saying on the internet." "About you and that elderly man." Richard closed his eyes, gripping the phone so hard his knuckles turned white. "Catherine, is it true he helped you? That you denied knowing him? That you laughed at him?" "Yes," the word came out as a whisper. "Yes, it's true." The silence on the other end of the line was worse than any shouting. "How could you?" she finally asked, and there was real pain in her voice. "You always taught us about gratitude, about honesty, about character, and all of that was a lie." "It wasn't a lie, But he couldn't finish the sentence. Because it was a lie. Yes, all of it. The entire persona he had built, the whole man he pretended to be. "I have to go," Catherine said, her voice choked up. "I can't talk to you right now." The line went dead. Richard stood there, holding the dead phone, feeling pieces of himself shatter one by one. Meanwhile, Walter was at home, a small house on the outskirts of the city that had been his dwelling for over 40 years. The walls needed painting, the roof had some loose shingles, but it was his home. Every corner held memories of a life lived with simplicity, but also with dignity. He wasn't alone. His neighbor, Mrs. Dorothy, a 68-year-old lady who had lived next door since before Walter moved there, had insisted on staying with him. She made tea and listened quietly as he told the whole story for the first time in decades. "And you never looked for him after he graduated?" asked Dorothy, her wrinkled hands holding the teacup. "I did look," Walter admitted, gazing out the window. "Once, a few years later, I found out where he worked, in a small office, but when I got there and saw him all dressed up, talking to important people," he paused, "I realized I didn't belong in that world, and that maybe it was better that way." "Better for whom?" Dorothy questioned gently. "For him. I was a reminder of a time he probably wanted to forget, of rock bottom, of nights spent crying, of desperation. Who wants to remember that when they've finally managed to climb up?" But without remembering where we came from, we forget who we are, Dorothy said wisely. And it seems that's exactly what happened to your Richard. Walter nodded sadly. That was exactly it. The boy he had known, who cried on his shoulder and said he would never find his way, had been replaced by a man who thought he could step on others for having less. It was as if success had erased not only the memory of Walter, but the memory of his own humanity. And that story about the fake documents, Dorothy asked. Were they really fake? No. Walter shook his head. It was all a misunderstanding. A clerk at the records office, Howard, he had issues with me for years, ever since I reported him for overcharging elderly people who went to get their documents. When my house caught fire last year and I lost everything, I had to redo my documents. Birth certificate, everything, but Howard pulled some strings. Made it look like they were fake, got me into a legal process. That Howard needs to pay for what he did. Dorothy was outraged. Maybe. But that's not what worries me now. Walter looked at his own hands, calloused and trembling. What worries me is Richard. What will happen to him? To him? Dorothy seemed surprised. Walter, after the way he treated you, you still worry about him? I can't help but worry. He was a good boy. He just lost his way somewhere. And now, he sighed. Now everyone will know. His family, his colleagues. I wouldn't wish that on anyone who's wronged me. That fundamental kindness, that inability to hold a grudge, was what defined Walter. And also what had defined that moment, so many years ago, when he saw an unknown young man on the brink of the abyss and decided to extend a hand. Back in the courtroom, an investigation had been opened. Not just about Walter's case, but about Richard's conduct. The Judicial Council had no choice after what had happened publicly. The senior judge of the district, Judge William Thompson, a 67-year-old man with an impeccable reputation, was assigned to oversee the proceedings. He called Richard to a private meeting in his office. The room was lined with law books, the scent of old paper and fresh coffee in the air. Judge William gestured to an armchair, and Richard sat down, feeling as small as a child in the principal's office. "Richard," Judge William began, his voice not cruel but firm. "You understand the gravity of the situation, don't you?" "Yes, sir," Richard replied, looking at his own hands. "I'm not sure you do," the older judge continued. "This isn't just about you having known the defendant. It's about you deliberately placing yourself in a position to judge someone with whom you had a personal history. And more than that, it's about how you treated him." "I didn't know it was him," Richard tried to defend himself. "At first, I really didn't recognize, but when you did recognize him, you denied it," Judge William interrupted him. "You chose to continue the humiliation even after knowing who he was. That is infinitely worse." Richard had no answer for that. It was the raw and painful truth. "Do you know what bothers me the most, Richard?" The older judge leaned forward. "It's not even the legal issue. It's what this says about who you've become. I've known you for years. I've seen you rise. I thought you were a man of integrity. And now I find out it was all built on a false foundation." "Not all of it was false," Richard protested weakly. "I worked hard, I studied, I dedicated myself. With someone's help," Judge William reminded him. "Someone you tried to erase from your history. Why, Richard? Out of shame? Out of pride?" "Both," Richard admitted, his voice barely more than a whisper. I wanted to believe I had done it all on my own, that I was strong enough, smart enough. Accepting that I needed help seemed like weakness. And now? Now I know the real weakness was denying that help," Richard said, tears beginning to form in his eyes again. "It was forgetting who extended a hand when I needed it most." Judge William nodded slowly. "You will be temporarily suspended while we investigate. And Richard, even if there are no legal consequences, you need to understand that your reputation is tarnished. Perhaps forever. People don't forget this kind of thing." "I know," Richard agreed miserably. "There is something you can do," the older judge added after a pause. "You can start to fix this. It won't erase what happened, but you can start building something new on the rubble." "How?" "You know how," Judge William replied simply. You need to confront your past. Truly confront it. And that starts with Mr. Walter. But confronting Walter was easier said than done. Richard tried several times during the following week. He picked up the phone, dialed the number he had obtained through contacts, but always hung up before completing the call. He drove to the street where Walter lived, but sat in the car, unable to get out. What would he say? Sorry for denying your existence. Sorry for laughing at your life of honest work. Sorry for becoming everything you never were, arrogant, cruel, ungrateful. While Richard wrestled with his demons, Walter was wrestling with his own. His lawyer, a young recent graduate named Benjamin Harris, had taken the case almost by accident. In fact, he was in the courtroom that day covering for a colleague and witnessed the entire scene. Benjamin came to Walter's house 3 days after the hearing, carrying a briefcase full of documents. "Mr. Walter, you have a strong case," he explained, spreading papers across the small living room table. "Not just to dismiss the charges against you, but also to sue for emotional damages. The court, the judge, even the courthouse clerk who started this." "I don't want to sue anyone," Walter said calmly. Benjamin blinked, confused. But they publicly humiliated you, falsely accused you. You're entitled to compensation." "My boy," Walter smiled sadly. "Money won't restore my dignity. It won't make Richard remember who he was. It won't fix anything. It'll only make everything worse." "With all due respect, Mr. Walter, you're being naive," Benjamin insisted. "These people need to pay for what they did." "Pay how? With money, with jail time?" Walter shook his head. "That's not how it works. True justice doesn't come from courts, it comes from what we carry here inside." He touched his own chest. "And I don't want to carry anger." Benjamin stayed silent for a long moment, looking at this elderly man who had been treated so terribly yet refused to seek revenge. There was a lesson there, he realized, a lesson they didn't teach in law school. "You're a better man than I would be," Benjamin admitted finally. "I'm not better than anyone," Walter corrected gently. "I'm just too tired to hold grudges. Life is too short for that." But while Walter chose forgiveness, the legal system followed its course. The case against him was quickly dismissed after deeper analysis of the documents revealed they were genuine. More than that, they discovered exactly what Walter had said. Howard Jenkins, the courthouse clerk, had manipulated the records. Howard was called to testify. He was a 45-year-old man with a prominent belly and a permanently sour expression. When confronted with the evidence, he tried to deny it, but there was no escape. His own electronic fingerprints were all over the system. "Why did you do this?" the prosecutor asked during questioning. "What was your problem with Mr. Walter?" "He made me lose a promotion." Howard spat the words with venom. "Years ago he reported some fees I was charging. They weren't even illegal, just some extra charges. Everyone did it, but he had to make a scene." "The fees were illegal, yes," the prosecutor corrected. "And you lost the promotion because you were deemed dishonest, so you decided to take revenge on an elderly man? Years later?" Howard didn't answer, but his silence was confession enough. He would be charged with document forgery and abuse of authority. Ironically, the same crimes he had tried to pin on Walter. This revelation brought some comfort, but also raised more questions. How had Howard managed to specifically direct his case to Richard's court? That couldn't be coincidence. The investigation revealed something even more sinister. Howard had a nephew, Robert Jenkins, who worked as a process server. Robert was the one who had actually masterminded the plan. He knew a court officer who directed the case for payment to the court where Richard presided. But why specifically that court? The answer was disturbing. Robert had done research on Walter after his uncle told him about his planned revenge. He discovered his past, about his work as a janitor, and by pure chance he discovered a connection. One of the buildings where Walter had worked was where Richard had lived during his studies. Robert put the puzzle together. He bet that Richard wouldn't recognize or wouldn't admit to recognizing a former janitor, that the judge's position would make Richard arrogant enough to publicly humiliate someone from a lower class. And he was right. It was a diabolical plan based on the worst of human nature. And it would have worked perfectly if Walter hadn't had the courage to speak about his shared past with the judge. When this information came to light, Richard felt nauseous. He had been manipulated, yes, but he had also freely chosen to be cruel. No one forced him to laugh. No one forced him to scorn. He made those choices alone. Elizabeth discovered everything through the newspapers. Sitting in the living room of her well-decorated home, reading article after article about her husband, she felt something break inside her. It wasn't just about what he had done to Walter. It was about all the lies, all the times he told stories of his solitary struggle, all the times she admired him for his supposed strength. She began to question everything. If he could lie about this, about something as fundamental as his own origin, what else had he lied about? About business? About money? About other people? "You make me question 28 years of marriage," she said when Richard came home that night. "If I really know the man I married—" "Elizabeth, please—" "No," she interrupted him, her voice cold but controlled. "You will listen to me now. All these years I admired your story, the poor young man who made it in life through effort and intelligence. I told that story to our daughter. I used you as an example of integrity. And it was all a lie." "Not all of it was a lie," Richard tried to argue weakly. "But the foundation was. The foundation was a lie. You built everything on an omission, and when confronted with the truth, your first choice was cruelty." Tears began to stream down Elizabeth's face. "Who are you? Because you're not the man I thought I knew." Richard had no answer. Who was he? An imposter. A man who had run from his own past for so long that he had gotten lost along the way. "I want time," Elizabeth said finally. "I'm going to my sister's house for a few weeks. I need to think." "Elizabeth, no. And you need to decide who you want to be," she continued, already picking up her keys. "The man who was capable of that cruelty, or the boy that Mr. Walter knew, because that boy, the one who cried on a bridge, still had humanity. Still had a heart. I want to know if he still exists somewhere inside you." She left, closing the door with a gentleness that was more painful than any slam. Richard stood alone in the large, empty house, surrounded by all the symbols of his success, and had never felt so bankrupt. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. Catherine arrived 2 days later. She didn't announce she was coming. She simply appeared at the door with her backpack, her eyes red from crying so much. Richard hugged her, and she allowed it, but didn't return the gesture. "Why did you do it, Dad?" she asked when they finally sat down in the living room. "And don't give me excuses, I want the truth." Richard looked at his daughter, this young woman who studied the human mind, and knew he couldn't lie even if he wanted to. She would know. "Because I was ashamed," he said, and the words hurt as they came out. "Ashamed of where I came from. Ashamed of what I was. Of that desperate boy who needed charity from a janitor." "Charity," Catherine repeated, incredulous. "Dad, that wasn't charity, it was kindness, it was humanity. How can you turn that into something negative?" "Because in my head, accepting help was admitting weakness. And I spent my whole life trying to prove I wasn't weak." He ran his hands through his hair, frustrated. Every promotion, every case won, every moment of recognition was another layer of distance between me and that boy on the bridge. Until one day, I looked in the mirror and the boy had completely disappeared. "And you didn't miss him?" Catherine asked softly. Richard thought about the question, really thought. "I felt," he finally admitted. "Sometimes, at odd moments, I'd see someone helping another person and feel something like longing or remorse. But I pushed it down, told myself I had moved past that I was stronger now." "But you didn't get stronger, Dad," Catherine said, tears streaming down her face. "You got harder. There's a difference. Strength is being vulnerable and still moving forward. Hardness is closing your heart so you don't feel anything." These words hit Richard like a punch. His daughter, just 25 years old, had articulated something it took him decades to build up in himself, the difference between true strength and the false armor of insensitivity. "I don't know how to fix this," he confessed, his voice broken. "I don't know how to go back. how to undo the wrong I've done. Start with him, Catherine said simply. With Mr. Walter. You need to go to him, not by phone, not by letter, in person. And you need to be honest, completely honest about everything. What if he doesn't forgive me? Then you learn to live with the consequences of your choices, she replied, and there was an adult hardness in her voice that Richard had never heard before. But at least you tried to do the right thing. Richard knew she was right, but knowing and doing were different things. In the following days, he started the trip to Walter's house several times. He even got in the car, turned on the ignition, but he always found an excuse to postpone. Until one morning, a rainy Monday, much like that one from so many years ago, he just went, without thinking too much, without planning what he would say. Just drove. Walter's house was on a quiet street, small and well-kept houses despite their age. Richard parked across the street and sat there, watching. Through the window he could see movement. Someone cooking, perhaps. A simple, honest life continuing despite everything. He took a deep breath, got out of the car, crossed the street. Each step felt heavier than the last. When he reached the door, he raised his hand to knock, but hesitated. What was he doing? After everything, what right did he have to show up there? But before he could decide to turn back, the door opened. It was Walter, holding a trash bag, obviously on his way to put it out on the street. They stared at each other, neither moving. Walter seemed smaller than Richard remembered, more fragile, the grey hair thinner, the shoulders more hunched. But the eyes were the same. Kind, tired, but without anger. "Richard," Walter said finally, and the simple sound of his name in that familiar voice made something in Richard break. "Mr. Walter, But the words wouldn't come. There was so much to say, so much to explain, so much to apologize for, that it all got stuck in his throat. Walter watched him for a long moment, then simply nodded and moved away from the door. "Come in," he said. "It's starting to rain." It was indeed. The first drops were beginning to fall, cold and persistent. Richard entered, wiping his feet on the doormat instinctively. The house was small but clean and tidy. It smelled of fresh coffee and something baking in the oven. "Sit," Walter gestured to the old but comfortable sofa. "I'll get coffee." "You don't have to." "Yes, I do," Walter interrupted gently. "You need coffee. You always needed it when you had something difficult to face." The observation, so casual yet so loaded with memory, made Richard sit down abruptly, as if his legs had been cut out from under him. Walter still remembered. After everything, after all these years of silence and denial, Walter still remembered small details about who he was. Walter returned with 2 cups, 1 for each. The coffee was strong, exactly how Richard liked it. Exactly how Walter remembered he liked it. "Mr. Walter," Richard began again, his hands trembling as he held the cup. "I don't know where to begin." "Start with why," Walter suggested, sitting in the armchair across. "Why did you come here today?" Because I owe it to you. I owe you an explanation, an apology. You owe me nothing," Walter interrupted him calmly. "You never did. Everything I did for you, I did because I wanted to, because it was the right thing to do, not because I expected anything in return. But You lost your way," Walter continued, his voice gentle but firm. "It happens. Life has a way of making us forget where we came from, especially when we get to where we always wanted to be. You built a life, Richard, a good life. And maybe you thought that acknowledging the help you received would somehow diminish it. It wouldn't," Richard said, tears finally starting to fall. "Nothing I achieved would be diminished because of your help. In fact, everything I am, everything I've accomplished, is because you gave me a second chance when I was ready to give up on everything." The words poured out now, years of denial unraveling. "I remember everything, every conversation, every cup of coffee, every time you stayed up late just to keep me company. I remember the day I passed the exam and you cried more than I did. I remember how you used to sell your lunch to give me food, how you worked overtime to get money for my 4th attempt at the exam." "The watch," Walter said softly. "The watch," Richard confirmed, his crying intensifying. "It was your father's. You told me. It was the only valuable thing you had, and you sold it to pay for my registration. And I never paid you back. I never thanked you properly. I never—" "Richard," Walter leaned forward, his old and calloused hand landing on Richard's knee. "Stop. Stop torturing yourself with this." "How can I stop? You saved me and I treated you like trash." "And it hurts, I know," Walter said, "but drowning in that pain doesn't help anyone. What's past is past. The question is, what are you going to do now?" Richard looked at him through the tears. "I don't know. I've lost everything. My wife is thinking of leaving me. My daughter can barely look at me. My career is over. My reputation is destroyed. And I deserve it. I deserve all of it." "Maybe," Walter agreed, and his honesty hurt, but it was also a relief. "But the question isn't whether you deserve it or not. It's whether you're going to use it to become bitter or to become better." "How can I become better? After everything?" Walter leaned back in the armchair, his eyes fixed on the ceiling for a moment, as if searching for the right words. "You know, when I was young, I made my own mistakes. I hurt people. I said things I shouldn't have. I made choices I regret." He paused. "No one is perfect, Richard. Not even me. The difference is what we do with our mistakes. What did you do? I learned to live with them, to acknowledge them, to try to be better every day, even knowing that some damage can't be undone." Walter looked at him directly. "And I learned that forgiving is more about freeing myself than about the other person. Forgiving you frees me from the burden of carrying anger." "So you forgive me?" Richard asked, hardly daring to believe. "Even after everything?" "I already have," Walter said simply. "I forgave you the moment you admitted the truth in that courtroom. I saw the boy I knew coming back to the surface, scared, lost, but still there." Richard broke down. It wasn't a restrained cry. It was a deep and uncontrolled sobbing. All the years of building walls, of pretending toughness, of denying vulnerability, everything crumbled at once. And Walter let him. He just stayed there, a calm and steady presence, exactly as he had been decades ago. When Richard finally calmed down, exhausted and emptied, they sat in silence for a long time. The rain outside had intensified, drumming against the windows, creating a cocoon of sound around them. "What do I do now?" Richard finally asked, his voice hoarse. "How do I live with what I've done?" "You live by doing differently," Walter replied. "You wake up every day and choose to be better than yesterday. You treat people with the dignity they deserve, no matter who they are. You remember where you came from, not with shame but with gratitude, and you pass on the kindness you received." "And my family?" "Family is more complicated," Walter admitted. "I can't say your wife will come back or your daughter will forgive you. That depends on them and you. But I can say honesty is the only way. No more lies. No more omissions. If you want to regain their trust, you have to earn it back, one day at a time." Richard nodded slowly. It made sense. Everything made sense when Walter spoke. It always had. That was why that desperate boy from so many years ago had listened, because somehow Walter had a clarity about life that came from simplicity, from honest work, from never losing touch with what truly mattered. "Mr. Walter," Richard said after another long silence, "can I ask you something?" "Of course. Why? Why did you help me that night? You didn't know me. You owed me nothing. Why pull a complete stranger off the bridge and change your whole life to help him?" Walter smiled, a sad but also content smile. "Because someone did that for me once," he said, "when I was even younger than you were then. I was going through a hard time, struggling to give up on everything. And a stranger, a man I never saw again, helped me, gave me a place to stay, food, work, gave me hope when I had none." "I never knew that," Richard said, surprised. "It wasn't about you knowing," Walter explained. "It was about passing it on. He helped me, so I helped you. And I always hoped that one day, when you were in a position to help, you would do the same for someone else." Guilt hit Richard again, but differently this time. Not the paralyzing guilt of shame, but the productive guilt of responsibility. He hadn't just denied Walter, he had broken a chain of kindness that should have continued through him. "I failed at that too," he admitted. "I became a judge, had power, resources, influence, and I used it all to lift myself up, never to lift others." "Then it's time to change that," Walter said pragmatically. "It's never too late to start doing the right thing." They talked for hours. Richard told him about his career, his inner battles, how every success seemed to amplify his fear of being found out. Walter told him about his life after Richard left, about the building he worked in for so many years, about the people he met and helped along the way. "You know," Walter said at one point, "when I saw you in that courtroom wearing that robe, being so different from the boy I knew, my heart broke a little. Not for me, but for you. Because I saw you had lost something precious. That vulnerability, that openness to receiving help. That was your strength, Richard. And you turned it into shame." "How do I get that back?" Richard asked. "How do I become that boy again?" "You don't," Walter said honestly. "You can't erase the years, the experiences, the choices, but you can integrate that boy into the man you are today. You can recognize that both are you, the vulnerable and the strong, the one who needs help and the one who can help." This idea of integration instead of denial was revolutionary for Richard. He had spent so long trying to kill the boy he had been that he never considered he could exist with him, instead of in spite of him. When the rain finally stopped and the sky began to clear, Richard prepared to leave. But at the door he hesitated. "Mr. Walter, the watch. I want to make up for the watch. I can buy a new one or give you the money." "No," Walter interrupted him gently but firmly. "The watch was my gift. If you give me money now, it turns that into a transaction. And it wasn't a transaction, it was a gift, it was love." "Then let me do something," Richard insisted. "Anything. I need—" "There is one thing," Walter considered. "Not for me, but for others. Use your position, even if it's shaken now, to help people like you once were. Lost young people, without hope, without resources. Be for them what I was for you. That would be the best. Thank you." Richard nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He hugged Walter, a long, tight hug, and this time it was returned. Everything was there, in that hug. Forgiveness, gratitude, pain, hope, and a connection that should never have been broken. "Thank you," Richard whispered, "for everything, for always, for—" "Go in peace, boy," Walter said, using the affectionate term he always used decades ago. "And remember, you are better than your worst moments." Richard returned to his car, but this time he didn't feel empty. He felt something different. It wasn't exactly peace, but it was the beginning of it. It was the possibility of redemption. And for the first time in weeks, he felt that maybe, just maybe, he could find a way back to himself. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out, now continuing. In the following days, Richard began the slow process of rebuilding. First, he called Elizabeth. She agreed to meet him at a neutral cafe, far from home, far from the courthouse, just the two of them. Elizabeth arrived punctually, as always. She was different, not in appearance, but in the way she looked at him. There was a distance that had never been there before, an invisible but definite wall. "Thank you for coming," Richard said when she sat down. "I'm not doing this for you," Elizabeth said directly. "I'm doing it for me. I need answers." "I'll give you all the answers you want," Richard promised. "No lies, no omissions. You deserve the complete truth." And then he told her everything. Not just about Walter, but about the years before he met her. About the poverty he came from, the depression that almost killed him, the desperate studying, the failures that made him feel like a total failure. "When I met you," he explained, "I had already managed to distance myself from that time. I had already passed the exam, I was working, building a life, and I wanted so much for you to see me as a winner, as someone strong, that I started editing my story. At first, it was just small omissions, not mentioning how much I struggled, not mentioning how much help I received, but over time the omissions became lies, and the lies became my official version of the story. Elizabeth listened in silence, her face a mask of restraint. When he finished, she remained quiet for a long moment. "Do you know what hurts the most?" she finally said. "It's not so much the lie about your past, it's what that says about our relationship. You didn't trust me enough to show me your vulnerability. Even after 28 years, even after having a daughter together, you kept this wall between us." "You're right," Richard admitted, "and there's no excuse for that. I was so busy protecting the image I created of myself that I forgot to be real with the people who mattered most." "So, who are you really?" Elizabeth asked. "Because I need to know. I can't stay married to a facade. I'm someone who came from very little, who struggled a lot, who almost gave up on life but was saved by the kindness of a stranger," Richard answered, choosing each word carefully. "I'm someone who on the path to success lost important parts of myself, who became arrogant and cruel, but I'm also someone who wants to change, who wants to be better, who wants to regain the humanity I lost." "Words are easy," Elizabeth said, but her voice was less cold now. "Actions are what matter. I know, and I'll show you, every day. For as long as it takes," Richard promised. "But I'll understand if you want to move forward without me. I'll understand if I broke this beyond repair." Elizabeth looked at her own hands, her fingers playing with the wedding ring she still wore. "I don't know yet," she admitted. "Part of me wants to leave. Part of me wants to stay and see if you can really change. I'm divided." "Then take your time," Richard said. "I won't pressure you. I'll just show you, through my actions, who I choose to be from now on." They parted without clear resolutions, but also without fully closed doors. It was more than Richard had hoped for, and perhaps more than he deserved. Catherine was more direct. When they met again, she went straight to the point. "Did you talk to him? To Mr. Walter?" "I did," Richard confirmed. "I spent an entire afternoon with him." "And?" "And he forgave me," Richard said, still amazed by this fact. "Despite everything, he forgave me." "He always seemed to be that kind of person," Catherine observed. "But the question isn't whether he forgave you, it's whether you'll do something with that forgiveness." "I will," Richard promised. "I'm starting a foundation to help young people who are where I was, low-income law students, especially those who are failing and losing hope. I'll use my own resources, and I'll also seek donations." Catherine looked at him with surprise and something that looked very much like cautious pride. That's good, Dad. "And I'll ask Mr. Walter to be an advisor," Richard continued. "Not just because his name will lend credibility, but because he knows how to do this right, how to help without belittling, how to give hope without creating dependency." "Have you talked to him about this?" "Not yet, but I will. I want to do this the right way." Catherine nodded slowly. "You know this doesn't erase what you did, right? With him, with me, with Mum." "I know," Richard said. "It's not about erasing, it's about building something new, something better." "Then I'll support it," Catherine decided. "But Dad, you need to be consistent. It can't be just a project you do for a few months until things calm down. It needs to be a real commitment." "It will be," he promised. "I have many years of selfishness to make up for." Their relationship wasn't healed, but the possibility of healing had begun, and for now, that was enough. Meanwhile, the legal proceedings against Richard progressed. Judge William and the Judicial Council had decided that while there was no formal crime, there had been a serious breach of ethics. Richard was suspended for 6 months and would have to go through a review process before being able to practice again. But the harshest punishment didn't come from the council, it came from his peers. Other judges avoided him. Invitations to professional events stopped coming. His reputation, once impeccable, was destroyed. Strangely, Richard found he didn't mind as much as he'd expected. His entire life had been built around that reputation, that image, and now that it was shattered, he felt something unexpected: relief. As if a huge weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He used the suspension time to work on the foundation. He spoke with Walter, who initially hesitated but eventually agreed to participate. Together, they began creating something that Richard hoped would be the beginning of his redemption. The foundation was officially launched 3 months after the courtroom incident. Richard insisted it be called the Walter Thompson Foundation over Walter's protests that this was unnecessary. But Richard was inflexible. The name needed to be a constant reminder for him and for others of what truly mattered. The response was surprising. Many people, including some who had turned their backs on Richard, contributed. Perhaps because the story had touched something in them. Perhaps because they saw in it their own struggles and their own failures. Or perhaps simply because it was a good cause. The first group of beneficiaries included 15 young people, all low-income law students who had failed the bar exam at least once. Richard and Walter met them personally, heard their stories, their struggles, their fears. One of them, a 23-year-old named Brandon, reminded Richard so much of his younger self that it was almost painful. He had failed twice, was working 3 jobs to support himself, and was on the verge of giving up. "I don't know if I can do it anymore," Brandon admitted during the first meeting, his eyes red from exhaustion. "Maybe this isn't for me. Maybe I'm just not smart enough." Richard looked at Walter, who nodded encouragingly. It was time to share his own story, the real one. "Brandon," Richard began, "I failed 3 times, not twice, 3. And the third time, I was exactly where you are now, thinking I wasn't enough, that I never would be." He told the full story then. No edits, no omissions. He told about the bridge, about the despair, about how Walter saved him. He told about the years of studying in the tool room, about the sacrifice of the watch, about every small moment of kindness that kept him alive. "And then I passed," Richard continued, "and I became a lawyer, then a judge. And in the process, I forgot where I came from. I forgot who helped me. I became exactly the kind of person who would have looked down on the young man I was." He paused, emotion thick in his voice. "I'm telling you this because you need to know 2 things. First, failing doesn't mean you're not capable. It means you need more time, more help, maybe a different approach. Second, never, ever forget where you came from and who helped you along the way, because success without gratitude is empty. It's a beautiful prison, but it's still a prison." The impact of these words was visible, not just on Brandon, but on all the young people present. They had expected generic encouragement, maybe some study tips. They didn't expect this raw, honest vulnerability from a judge. "And if I pass but then become like you became?" Brandon asked hesitantly. "No offense, sir." "None taken," Richard said. "It's a good question, and the answer is, you might. We all might. Success has a way of distorting our perspective if we're not careful. That's why this foundation isn't just about helping you pass the exam. It's about reminding you always of the community that supported you, of the kindness you received, and of the responsibility that comes with success." Walter added his own perspective. "Each of you here will face choices," he said in his calm, wise voice. "Choices about what kind of professional to be, what kind of person to be. You'll be tempted to cut corners, to step on others to get ahead, to forget your roots. And no one can make those choices for you. But I hope that when the time comes, you remember this room, this conversation, and choose to be people who lift others up, not push them down." The foundation meetings became weekly. They didn't just study law but discussed ethics, social responsibility, how to maintain humanity in a profession that can be brutal. Richard found in these meetings something he hadn't felt in years: genuine purpose. Elizabeth started attending the meetings after the 2nd month. At first, she stayed in the back, just observing, but gradually she began to participate. As a business administrator, she had valuable skills to offer about organization and management. One night, after a particularly moving meeting where 3 of the scholarship recipients announced they had passed the exam, Elizabeth pulled Richard aside. "This," she said, gesturing to the room where the young people were celebrating with Walter. "This is who you should have been all along." "I know," Richard agreed. "I'm sorry it took me so long to find my way back." "Me too," Elizabeth said, and then, for the first time in months, she touched his hand. It was just a brief touch, but it was loaded with meaning. I think I want to come home. Our home. Not because everything is fixed, but because I want to be there to see you keep trying." Richard felt tears burning his eyes. "Are you sure?" "No," Elizabeth admitted honestly, "but I think marriage isn't about being sure all the time. It's about choosing to stay, even when it's hard, and I choose to stay. For now." They embraced, right there in the crowded room, and Richard felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Real. Tangible. Not based on illusions or denials, but on genuine effort and true change. Catherine was also there that night. She had started working with the foundation as a volunteer, using her psychology skills to help the scholarship recipients deal with anxiety and stress. When she saw her parents embracing, she smiled. It wasn't a full smile yet. There was still unresolved pain and disappointment, but it was a start. Walter watched everything from his corner, a cup of coffee in hand, because there was always coffee at the meetings, a tradition he had insisted on. His heart was filled with a complex emotion. There was sadness for what was lost. All those years Richard had been lost. But there was also joy for what was being built now. "You did a good thing," Mrs. Dorothy, who had started helping with organizing the meetings, said beside him. Not just saving him that night on the bridge, but also now, showing that there was room for forgiveness. It wasn't so much about forgiveness, Walter reflected. It was about giving room for growth. We all deserve second chances. Some just need more reminders about why. The months passed. The foundation grew. More scholarship recipients, more volunteers, more success stories. Richard returned to work after his suspension, but he was a different judge, more humble, more compassionate, more aware of the power his words and actions had. One day, he had to judge a case similar to Walter's, an elderly man accused of forgery. Richard made sure to hear the full story, to investigate properly, to treat the accused with dignity regardless of the charges. The case was dismissed when it was discovered to be an administrative misunderstanding. After the hearing, the elderly man approached Richard. "Thank you, sir, for listening to me, for treating me like a person." Richard felt a tightness in his chest. Those simple words were what Walter should have heard from him that day in court, but he hadn't. Instead, he had heard laughter and scorn. "It's my duty," Richard said, "and it should always have been." He told Walter about the case later, during one of their regular coffees that had become a tradition. "You did the right thing," Walter said, smiling, "and you'll keep doing it. Not because you're perfect, but because you're choosing to be better." "I still have difficult days," Richard admitted. "Days when the temptation to fall back into old habits is strong. To be harsh, to be arrogant." "Normal," Walter said. "Real change isn't linear. It has its ups and downs. The important thing is the overall direction." They sat in silence for a moment, comfortable in each other's company. The wound between them wasn't completely healed. Perhaps it never would be, but it had scarred over enough to allow for a new relationship. No longer mentor and mentee, no longer savior and saved, but something closer to friends. Friends with a complicated history, but friends nonetheless. "Mr. Walter," Rodrigo eventually said, "can I ask something I've always wanted to know?" "Of course. Have you ever regretted it? Helping me? Especially after how I treated you?" Walter thought about the question carefully before answering. "Regret? No. Disappointed? For a while, yes. But regret implies I wouldn't do it again if I could go back. And I would. Because that night on the bridge, I saw a human being in pain. And responding to that, reaching out, wasn't about what you might become or what you could give me in return. It was about doing what was right in that moment. Even knowing how things would turn out?" "Even knowing," Walter confirmed. "Because look where we are now. Look at what's being built. Look at how many young people are being helped. If I hadn't helped you that night, none of this would exist. So no, I don't regret it. The path was winding, but we got where we needed to go." That perspective, that ability to see the long arc of history rather than just the painful moments, was something Rodrigo was learning from Walter. It was a wisdom that only came with age and experience, from living a full life with its ups and downs. "I want to be like you when I grow up," Rodrigo said, a half smile on his lips. Walter laughed, a genuine warm laugh. "Son, you already grew up too much, if I may say. Now it's time for you to become what you were always meant to be, yourself. Not a copy of me, not an edited version of your story, but you. Complete, with all the flaws and all the victories. It was simple advice, but profound, and Rodrigo took it to heart. On the Foundation's one-year anniversary, they organized a big event. It was a celebration, but also an opportunity to raise more funds and awareness. They invited the press, other legal professionals, even some local politicians. Rodrigo gave a speech. He had prepared something formal, but when he got to the microphone and saw all those people, beneficiaries of the Foundation, his family, Walter, he abandoned the prepared speech. "A year and a half ago," he began, "I was a different man. A man who thought he had gotten where he was all by himself. A man proud of a story that was partially a lie. A man who had forgotten the fundamental kindness that saved him when he was at rock bottom. The silence in the room was absolute. I was exposed in that courtroom before everyone, and it was the best thing that could have happened to me, because it forced me to confront who I had become and to choose who I wanted to be from then on." He looked at Walter, who was in the front row next to Mrs. Dorothy. "Mr. Walter saved me twice, once from the bridge when I was ready to give up on life, and once from myself when I was getting lost in arrogance and cruelty. Both rescues were necessary, and for both, I am eternally grateful." He paused, emotion thick in his voice. "This foundation is not charity. It's restitution. It's acknowledgement. It's a reminder for me and for everyone who takes part in it that none of us get anywhere alone. We all need help. We all deserve second chances. And we all have the responsibility to reach out to those who come after us." The applause was enthusiastic, but Rodrigo barely heard it. His eyes were on Walter, who was also applauding, tears streaming down his wrinkled face. Happy tears this time. After the event, when most people had left, the two met in the outdoor garden. The night was clear, stars visible above them. "Thank you," Rodrigo said, "for everything, forever." "You've already thanked me," Walter gently reminded him. "And I will keep thanking you," Rodrigo said. "Because a thank you is never enough for what you did for me." "Then don't thank me with words," Walter suggested. "Thank me with actions. Continue this work. Keep helping. Keep being better. That's the thanks that truly matters." Richard nodded, understanding. That was it. It was always that. Not grand gestures or declarations, but the constant work of being a better person, of helping others, of keeping the chain of kindness alive. "I will do that," he promised. "Every day, for the rest of my life." And he did. The years passed. The foundation continued to grow. Dozens, then hundreds of young people were helped. Many of them passed the exam, became lawyers, some even judges. And each one carried with them the lessons from those weekly meetings. Never forget where they came from. Never forget who helped them. Always reach down to pull others up. Richard and Elizabeth rebuilt their marriage. It wasn't easy, and there were tough times, but they persisted. They learned to communicate more honestly, to share vulnerabilities, to build on truth instead of the perfect image. Catherine became a psychologist and opened her own clinic, specializing in helping successful professionals who struggled with issues of identity and authenticity. She always said her father was her most important case study, though he preferred to be called her first success. Walter continued being Walter, working at the foundation, helping where he could, living his simple but rich life. Mrs. Dorothy eventually moved into his house after they discovered they enjoyed each other's company too much to live apart. They didn't marry officially, but they were partners in every sense that mattered. On his 80th birthday, the foundation organized a special celebration for Walter. He protested that it wasn't necessary, but was outvoted. The room was full of people whose lives he had touched over the years. Former foundation beneficiaries, former residents of the building where he worked, neighbors, friends. Richard gave another speech, but this one was personal. "When someone saves your life," he said, "you carry the mark of that kindness forever. Some people let that mark fade over time, covered by layers of pride and forgetfulness. I did that for many years, but I found that the mark was always there, underneath everything, waiting to be rediscovered." He looked at Walter, now frail, but with eyes still bright with intelligence and warmth. "Mr. Walter, you taught me that true strength isn't never falling. It's getting up after you've fallen. That true success isn't what you achieve, but who you become and who you help in the process. And that kindness is never wasted, even when it seems to go unrecognized. For these lessons, for your endless patience, for forgiving me when I didn't deserve forgiveness, and for continuing to believe in the boy you knew even when I had forgotten him," Richard's voice broke, "I am eternally grateful." Walter stood up slowly, leaning on his cane, and walked to Richard. They hugged, and in that hug was their entire journey. The pain, the forgiveness, the redemption, the love. "You were always a good boy," Walter whispered. "Just lost for a while. But you found your way back." "With your help," Richard whispered back. "Always with your help." The party continued late into the night. Stories were shared, laughter echoed, tears were shed. It was a celebration not just of Walter, but of everything he represented. The possibility of kindness in a sometimes cruel world, the power of second chances, the importance of never forgetting where we come from. Late at night, after most had left, Richard found Walter sitting alone in the garden looking at the stars. "Aren't you tired?" Richard asked, sitting down beside him. "Tired in body, yes," Walter admitted, "but happy in heart. Today was a good day." "It really was," Richard agreed. They stayed silent for a moment. Then Richard said, "I never asked you. The man who helped you when you were young, what happened to him?" "I never saw him again," Walter said. "He went his way, and I went mine. For years I felt bad for not being able to thank him properly. But then I realized that maybe he didn't need thanks. Perhaps for him, the act itself was enough." "Do you think he would be happy with what you did? With the chain of kindness you continued?" "I hope so," Walter said. "It's all I can do. Pass on what I received, and hope others do the same." Richard thought about that. The idea that kindness wasn't a transaction waiting for a return, but a gift to be passed forward. It was simple but revolutionary. "You know," Walter continued, "I used to think saving you on that bridge was my greatest feat. But now I see it wasn't just that. It was being there for you afterward. It was being there when you needed me. It was forgiving you when you made mistakes. And it was believing you could be better even when you stopped believing in yourself." "You never gave up on me," Richard said, the realization hitting him hard. "Never gave up," Walter confirmed. "Even in the silent years, even when you denied me. Part of me always believed the boy I met was still in there somewhere. And I was right." "I'm not always that boy," Richard admitted. "I still have moments of arrogance, of hardness." "We all do," Walter said philosophically. "Perfection isn't the goal. The effort is. You're trying, and that's all that matters." They stayed there until the stars began to fade with the approaching dawn. Two men, separated by age and experience, but connected by something deeper than blood. The choice of kindness, the practice of forgiveness, and the ongoing commitment to be better. In the following years, the story of Richard and Walter became something of a local legend. Law students knew it, as did young professionals and even children in the schools, where they both occasionally spoke about kindness and second chances. But for them, it was never about the legend. It was always about the day-to-day, about small choices that added up to big transformation, about recognizing mistakes and working to fix them, about keeping alive the memory of those who helped them and honoring that by helping others. The foundation thrived. They developed programs not just for law students, but for young people in all fields who needed support. They created mentorships, scholarships, emotional support groups. It became a model that other cities began to replicate. Walter lived to see all of this. He lived to see hundreds of young people he helped directly or indirectly become ethical and compassionate professionals. He lived to see Richard completely transformed, not just on the surface, but in the essence of who he was. When Walter finally passed at 87, it was in peace. Surrounded by Mrs. Dorothy, Richard and Elizabeth, Catherine and countless others he had touched throughout his life. His last words were for Richard. "Keep going," he whispered. Keep the kindness, keep the chain. Always, Richard promised through tears. Always. The funeral was huge. People from all corners of the city came. Beneficiaries of the foundation, former neighbors, co-workers from decades ago, each with a story about how Walter had impacted their lives. Some big, others small, but all meaningful. Richard gave the eulogy, but, unlike previous speeches, this one wasn't about him. It was all about Walter, about a man who lived a simple but extraordinary life, who never sought recognition but deserved it more than anyone, who saved lives not with grand gestures, but with consistent small acts of kindness. Mr. Walter taught me, Richard said, his voice echoing in the packed church, that a person's true legacy isn't measured in achievements or possessions, but in the hearts they touched and the lives they changed. By that measure, he was one of the richest men I've ever known. In the months after Walter's departure, Richard struggled with the loss. But he also found comfort in the foundation's work. Every young person he helped, every success story, every moment of kindness was an honor to Walter's memory. The foundation was officially renamed the Walter Thompson Institute, in memory of a man who saved lives through kindness. It was a long name, but it perfectly captured who Walter was. Elizabeth and Richard grew old together, their marriage now built on a foundation of honesty and vulnerability that made everything stronger. Catherine married and had her own children, who grew up hearing stories about their great-grandfather Walter, who wasn't a blood relative but was family in every way that mattered. Richard never stopped working at the Institute. Even when he retired from the judiciary, he continued as a volunteer president. He never allowed his own story to be forgotten, not out of pride, but as a lesson. He openly talked about his mistakes, his falls, his redemption. "I was saved," he often told new beneficiaries, not once but twice, first from the bridge, second from myself, and now I dedicate my life to paying that debt, knowing I can never fully repay it, but trying anyway. Years turned into decades. The story of Richard and Walter became part of the community's fabric, a story about what happens when we forget our humanity, but also about what happens when we reclaim it, about pride and humility, about denying and embracing, about forgetting and remembering. And somewhere on some plane beyond this one, Richard liked to imagine that Walter was watching, seeing the chain of kindness continue, seeing young people being helped, lives being changed, hope being given where there was despair, seeing that his life, that simple life of honest work and consistent kindness, had mattered. It had made a difference. Not just for one desperate boy on a bridge, but for hundreds, thousands of others through the years. And perhaps, just perhaps, Walter was smiling. That gentle, weary smile Richard remembered so well, satisfied not with recognition or glory, but with something much simpler and deeper. The joy of knowing his kindness had created ripples that would keep expanding long after he was gone. Because in the end, it's not about how long we live or how famous we become. It's about the hearts we touch, the lives we change, the kindness we pass on. And by that measure, Walter Thompson, a simple janitor who spent his life helping others, was a giant. And Richard Anderson Parker, a judge who almost lost himself but found his way back, spent the rest of his life making sure no one forgot that. End of story. Now tell us what you thought of the story and where you're watching from. If you have something to share with us, leave it in the comments with sincere words. Do you believe Richard truly managed to redeem himself? We'd love to read your opinion. Thank you so much for your company. Don't forget to leave your like and especially subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other moving stories.